Yes, I'll talk about the core ontology for biology and biomedicine, which is what COB stands for as a community resource. I'm presenting here, but this is really a very large number of people working on it, specifically the OOB Operations Committee and a number of other participants. So COB really came about from making the OOB interoperability principle testable. And what do I mean by that? So OOB, specifically the OOB Foundry, is a community of ontology developers that aim to facilitate the development, harmonization, application, and sharing of an interoperable set of ontologies. At this point, there's over 150 ontologies and counting. The OOB Foundry was initiated in 2006 and defined a set of goals and principles that should facilitate the ability to make this set of harmonized interoperable ontologies. The problem was that the idea was that these would be enforced or tested based on manual human review. And the problem with that was when that review happened, which first of all takes a lot of time, it was often still not clear if an ontology really conformed to a principle or not. So for a while now, we have, as the part of the OOB operations group, tried to work towards making the principles, or at least major parts thereof, computationally decidable. The idea of that is if we can make a computer do the work for us, first of all, we save expert volunteer time, but also really having to spell out for something as dumb as a computer, what we mean by the principle forces us to be extremely clear what it is, and actually makes it easier to argue over principles. So as an example, there's the open principle in the OOB Foundry, which essentially stated, and these are all a little bit abbreviated, the ontology must have an open license that allows for reuse. Now, the problem with that is then you have ultimately the argument of what is an open license. And there's people who care a lot about licenses and know a lot about them, and many others who just say, just tell me what to use. So the testable formulation of this principle is all the distributed classes that, all the distributed OWL files of an ontology must include a DC license annotation property that points to the URI of one of two approved CC licenses. Second part of this testable farce is that the OOB registry, which collects metadata for all the OOB ontologies, must have a matching license for the ontology that matches what's in the DC file. So that is a test that you can run automatically, and that is now implemented in something we call the OOB Dashboard. There's an alpha version out right now that is under very much active development, and the idea is that each of the 150 plus ontologies that are currently active in OOB are then being tested for each of the principles, open being one example here. And then you can see here, you get like a checkbox if it compiles, across if it doesn't. And actually when you mouse over it, it tells you what the problem is. And then you can actually click through and really get guidance on specifically what you should do to fix a problem. So that was thrown out there at the start of the year, and it actually has worked in the sense that we were wondering, like, what are people going to say? Are they going to be upset about this? And no, people have embraced it. And with people, I mean other OOB ontology developers. This kind of metric and seeing what is a problem or not has led people, and you see statistics here that are kind of hard to pass, to go in and fix these problems. So we've run these now over time. We see people address and fix the problems. And also not just the problems in their ontology, they also fix the problems in the tests. So you can argue, for example, are these the two approved CC licenses really all that are should be approved or not? So, but then you argue about something much more concrete rather than saying, please define what open means. So this was the goal, and we went through the principles, and one of the key principles really for OOB is this interoperability principle. How do you have an automated test if two ontologies interoperable? And so there, we were lucky enough to have William Baumgartner and Larry Hunter having run a really cool project where they reasoned over pairs of OOB ontologies. So they took two together, ran a reasoner over it, and asked what kind of logical inconsistency did they find? And surprisingly, at first, was that the number of inconsistencies really showed that pairs of ontologies that were more consistent if they were actually completely uninteroperable. And the reason for that is when you have two ontologies essentially talking completely past each other, not using any shared classes, they're going to be interoperable. Just because you're not making any statement in the same language. So, for example, there was the long known issue that the Go definition of cell and the cell ontology definition of cell were incompatible, but they just use different IDs. So the reasoner has no way of picking up that this is really what biologists would consider to be a serious flaw. The other issue was that all the ontologies in OOB are in principle saying that they're complying to the upper ontology BFO, but that was compliance as in on paper. And the ontologies didn't actually assert subclasses of BFO, so even that kind of interoperability couldn't really be tested for. So the idea was that we create a new ontology, the core ontology of biological and biomedicine, that would be addressing this. The scope here of COB would be that it provides a parent class to every OOB ontology class, so that the upper level is completely covered. COB should be anchored in BFO, but hide the complexity of BFO for end users. So the reason why people don't include BFO is they don't want to see things like continuant in their ontologies typically. And then COB should include logical axioms between these upper level classes that make inconsistency within and between ontologies apparent when you do something like Bill Baumgartner did through reasoning. And this is the GitHub site. So this is just illustrating, and I think most people here will know this, BFO has a number of upper level classes that are not immediately apparent when you're saying, okay, the reason as a cell ontology developer why I don't put BFO there is because it adds a lot of clutter essentially to the top of my ontology. So we have in COB a flattened view of BFO that has 6 classes that are essentially those classes in BFO that have subclasses as in OOB. And I mean, you could go to multiple levels there in BFO, but we're focusing on the level where essentially the terms used are, in quotes, non-threatening for ontology consumers. And the key is, though, that we keep the full logical axiomatization of BFO in the background. So when you reason over it, issues would apply here. And there's a number of technical challenges with this, actually. So here's an example of how COB looks like for material entities. So this would be the kinds of terms that are below BFO material entity, but they are covering the kinds of things that are in OOB ontologies, such as the physical world in terms of like physics, subatomic art particles, molecular entities, macromolecular entities, etc. Biology things like cellular components, cells, anatomical structures, and then human activities. So such as devices, reagents, those kinds of things that would be falling under processed materials. Then there's the non-material parts. So you have you have biological processes that are covered primarily in Go versus planned processes. That's some things like assays that are in OBI, and so on. And I think this takes too long to run through each of the examples, but you can see these were essentially assembled by going through what are the upper level classes that are present in OOB ontologies that are between the ontology and BFO, and trying to place these in COB. So, and why is that important? So as an example, you will have classes, if you come from the text mining region, so you see classes that are called nucleus. Now, if you have a class that is nucleus, that might be an atomic nucleus. If you're talking about nuclear particles, it might be the cell nucleus if you're talking about an organelle. It might be the nucleus of the brain if you're talking about an organ. Similar thing for vectors. You have mosquitoes are vectors of malaria. You have cloning vectors you use in experiment, or you use vectors in mathematics or support vector machines. So the idea, obviously, of this core is then to make these differences apparent and make clear that if you're talking about vector, what kind of vector do you mean? And kind of consolidate these kinds of inconsistencies. So the progress to date has been, we have developed, and this is actually Chris Mangel's work primarily, a testing approach to see what happens when you implement COB. And the idea is that essentially there's a mapping file taking for a given ontology the high-level classes and map them into COB, then take COB with all its axioms and reason of it together with the ontology, and ideally do that with multiple ontologies and see what happens. This has actually already led to a number of positive changes in ontologies. So for example, the cell ontology and Go ontology came together and said, okay, we really need to resolve it. We can't have two terms called cell that is this high level and need to decide what it is. And the idea is to have community consensus on how this goes forward. And then there's also a number of hard problems. So for example, macromolecule or just something like as atom. You have the definition of a physicist, and in atom have a certain number of protein and protons and neutrons. But for a chemist, you have something like a chemical species where the chemical element is made of atoms of different isotypes and different weights, and you have an effective weight. So the next steps for us is to finalize the alpha version of COB, mask out some of these hard issues. We will not be able to solve everything, but at least make sure that we can automate testing, unit testing, integration testing, by which we mean one ontology or multiple ontologies, and then develop COB in a stepwise fashion to address these issues. As I said, this is a large number of people here. I noticed I didn't have a complete slide. It was out of date. So there is like 40 or so people contributing to it. I put people up here from which I've stolen several of these slides. James has done lots of the robot work, and Becky has actually most of the COB work. Randy has done lots of the reviews. Chris has done the implementation of COB testing, etc. And then finally, shameless plug, my lab is hiring. If you're interested, let me know. That's it.
Great. Thank you so much, Bjoern. Very nice talk. We will only have time for one question, but then we'll be able to follow up into the Slack. So I'll pick the question here that Robert had posted. He says, to me, interoperability should also list a set of operations that should be possible between ontologies. Is there such a list of operations? And if there is, would they not be testable independently?
So that's a very interesting thought. So there is not right now. Right now, we are only looking for logical inconsistencies developed by a reasoner. I would be very excited to hear what kind of operations Robert has in mind, and we can totally talk about that. I think the benefit of this, even if we don't have that now, is that we would have a framework to test these. I mean, when we started off, lots of the issues were you couldn't even load the ontologies.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, this is really nice development. So thank you so much for sharing it. But owing to time, we'll move on to the next talk. Okay.